So good morning. This morning, uh, what seemed like a simple idea yesterday when it started, it has grown into, as I told Lori earlier, it could be a life's work. Could be, it could be the only thing that we need to discuss. So we will go with it today as far as we can go. If we get done today, fine. If not, we will pick it up again next week. And what we were talking about, the title as it came, was Escaping the Delusions of Mind. Escaping the Delusions of Mind. And there's a lot in that. There's a lot in that title. And you know me, if you've been in class with me or on the conference bridges on classes on Wednesday night, I like to look at the words that we use and how are we using them. Precisely how are we using these words? Because each word that we have in our language has many different meanings, and it's pretty much difficult, if not impossible, if you did not speak the language, to just simply take a dictionary and try to look up the meaning of words and get the meaning of a sentence, because in some cases words mean the opposite, depending upon the context of the sentence. So you have to understand the context before you can decide which meaning of the word to assign to that particular sentence. I tried this once. I bought a book. It was a novel. It was a science fiction novel, and it was in German. And I went and this is before the internet, I went and I bought a German to English dictionary, English to German, German to English. And I went through and I must have spent like 2 or 3 weeks on the first sentence, and I could never get it, And finally I showed the book to somebody who spoke German, and they looked at it and they told me exactly what it meant, And I said, well, how did you do that? I didn't get that from reading the definition. And they said, well, it's the context. You see, if you don't understand the bigger picture, you don't understand the context. Escaping the delusions of mind. Now, mind is one of those words that can mean many different things to many different people. With a capital M, it can mean God, as in science of mind, or in Christian Science, mind is another word for God. But the way that I'm using it here today, and I just want to give you that context so that you know where I'm coming from today. When I'm using mind today, I'm talking about the ideas that we hold, the opinions that we hold, the formulations of the mind, the conditioned mind, if you want to talk of it in the context as Buddhism does. The ideas, the things that we believe to be true, and that capability within us that I refer to as the intellect. I'm sure that other people would call it something else. But that capability within us to form those opinions in the first place. And then, of course, the ego, which is sort of the repository of those ideas and those opinions. So we as human beings are sort of, I used to call it lean, mean, map-making machines. We look at something, we assign meaning to it, we try to figure out what it means, how does it work, what does it do, and then that becomes part of our mental map. That becomes part of our map of the lay of the land, of the way that the world works. We believe our map to be true. We act as if that map is true. But in truth with a capital T, it may not be so. It's just our opinion. It's just our idea. It's a formulation of the mind. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about mind today. It is this collection of ideas that you and I as individuals, and then the human race, collective consciousness, race consciousness, carnal mind, if you want to refer to it in those terms, but the collective consciousness of the race, there are things that we have come to accept as being true that are not true. But it's done unto us according to our belief. And as long as we believe them to be true, we continue to have the experience as if those ideas are true. They become self-reinforcing. Or today, if you read about the internet, you might say that we all live in a filter bubble of our own creation. You know, that which agrees with our pre-existing beliefs kind of enters through our filters and enters our bubble. And that which disagrees doesn't make it. It's as if it's not even there. It's as if we didn't even see it. You know, it's just, we ignore the whole thing. So life becomes a matter of our beliefs getting reinforced over and over and over again. An interesting thing about that is that once we as human beings form an opinion, even if evidence comes to show us that this opinion may not be correct, we don't want to let go of the old idea, especially if we've told other people about it, especially if we go, especially if we wrote a book about it, or we gave a speech about it, or we went and we told a lot of people about it, and suddenly we find out it's not right. It's not true. It didn't happen. We don't like to give up those ideas. I was doing some research on how ideas are formed and how people change ideas and those kind of things, and I came across an article on the effectiveness of propaganda. Now, propaganda is just persuasive information. It's rhetoric designed to sway rather than to inform or to educate or to be balanced, but it's rather one side of a picture in hopes of swaying somebody. So when you go to buy a car, the salesperson is giving you one side of the picture, the one that they think you need to hear in order to buy that car, if you're going for a car, whatever you're buying. So this experiment was done, and what happened, what they did was they got a group of people, and they were focusing on a political race, and the group of people that they assembled were divided 50-50 for the two candidates. And then they showed the group a newspaper article, a scandalous newspaper article about one of the candidates. They had been accused of something or arrested for something that was outrageous, something that was just terrible. And they did another poll, and suddenly the opinion of the group that had been 50-50 shifted to like 80-20 against that person. And later they came back into the group and said, "Oh, we have a retraction here. It appears that article that you read that said that this person did these terrible things was in error. It wasn't that person at all. That person never did whatever it was that the previous article said they did." Now you would think that given it had been 50-50 and then it went 80-20, that you would think now it would go back to 50-50, but it didn't. It didn't. It went to like 60-40 or 65-35 or something like that. We are a curious specimen, you know. We form our opinions, and we want to be right. This idea that we have to be right, you know, becomes more important to us than the truth. So when I talk about mind today, escaping the delusions of mind, that's what I mean by mind. By mind, I mean not only that part of us that forms these opinions, but then this kind of shell that we live within, this crust that we live within, where we are trying to defend our opinions against objective facts and data. You know, don't bother me with the facts. I already know, kind of thing. So that's what we mean by mind. And then if you look at escaping, you know, it kind of indicates that we're being held captive. There's something that we need to escape from. And it also implies that there's something that we can escape to. There's another reality. There's another way of thinking. There's another way of knowing. There's another way of being. And the delusions that we're talking about is the things that we believe to be true that are simply not true. These are delusions of the mind. The mind tells us it's so. The senses tell us it's so. Our parents told us it's so. Our teachers told us it's so. But it's not so. It's not so. So if we are going to escape these delusions, the first thing we have to do is recognize that they're there. Right? We have to be willing to escape them. We have to be willing to admit that everything that we ever knew might be wrong. Everything. You got to put it all out there on the table. Everything I ever knew is possibly wrong, because the people who taught me were teaching from their delusions. See, the race consciousness of the planet is kind of surrounded in these delusions. And I have to be willing to examine all of that. Now, I'm not saying that we throw it all away and say, well, it's all wrong. Now, it could all be wrong, but we have to be willing to go back in and examine. We have to. This is our growth. This is our spiritual growth. We have to be willing to go back in and say, how do I know that's true? Is that true? How would I know if that were true? And if it's not true, am I willing to let go of it? I saw an interesting clip on TV one time, and it was Carl Sagan, the astronomer, and he was talking to the Dalai Lama. I don't know what the circumstances were, but he said to the Dalai Lama, he said, Dalai Lama, he said, Tibetan Buddhists, you believe in reincarnation, don't you? And the Dalai Lama said, yes. And Carl Sagan said to him, well, what would you do if I could prove to you that reincarnation didn't exist? And the Dalai Lama said, well, if we knew that it didn't exist, we wouldn't teach it any longer because it would be wrong. Why would we go on teaching something that's not true? And the next thing he said to Carl Sagan was, how would we go about proving that? It was almost like a desire, a curiosity that says, let's go. Let's go find, not a challenge, not a threat, but yes, that's an excellent point. Let's go find out. Let's go accept these tests. And you'll see, for example, today you'll see that Tibetan Buddhist monks are working with scientists in France to study the effects of meditation on consciousness, on how the brain works and how the body works. They're willing to explore these things because there's no desire to teach something that isn't true. There's no desire to be held up into an old belief just simply because it's an old belief, because it's tradition, you see. That's what I'm talking about, this willingness to say, if what I know or what I think I know or what I've been taught to believe, if it's not true, then I'm willing to let it go. These are the delusions of the mind. Now, just to give you an example of how simple they become self-reinforcing, W. Clement Stone, who wrote self-help pop psychology books, How to Succeed kind of books with Napoleon Hill, he gave an example that at one time he traveled a lot. He was an insurance salesman. He traveled a lot. And, you know, anybody who's traveled a lot for business, you know, you get tired of restaurant food after a while. What you would give for a hot plate and a can of condensed soup, you know, just something to remind you of home. And he was traveling a lot, and he sat down at the restaurant for supper, and they had frog legs on the menu, and he had never had them, and all his friends told him that frog's legs were delicious. So he ordered them, and they were terrible. They were terrible, and he immediately decided that he didn't care what his friends said. Frog's legs were terrible, and he lived for 20 years. He never ate another frog's leg. And he was out with a group of men one time they were traveling to a conference or something, and a group of them went to dinner, and one of them said, this restaurant has the best frog's legs you've ever eaten. You need to try them. And he said, well, I don't like frog's legs. And they said, oh, you'll like these. These are good. And the waiter heard them telling him this, and the waiter assured him, yes, the frog's legs here are delicious. So W. Clement Stone said, well, are they the jumbo or the regular kind? Because I don't like the jumbo kind. And the waiter said, oh, no, these are the regular kind. So he ordered them, and they came out, and they were these huge jumbo frog's legs. And he took a bite, and they were delicious. They were delicious. And what he realized was that for 20 years of his life, he avoided that food because he had a delusion of the mind. He had formed this opinion that said frog's legs are no good. Instead of saying, well, maybe that one batch was no good. Maybe there was something wrong with the way they were prepared. Maybe they spoiled in the refrigerator or something. But his mind immediately went to the conclusion, frog's legs are no good. And he lived his life accordingly for the next 20 years. So I want you to keep that in mind. We form these opinions about the way things are and the way things ought to be and the way we are and the way we ought to be and shoulds and all of these things. And then they become kind of like a guiding principle of our lives. We live our lives in a manner that is consistent with these delusions, these ideas that we have formed that are not true. So the first thing we have to do is recognize that they're there. The second thing we have to do is be willing to move beyond them. Right? Rumi says, beyond ideas of right doing and wrongdoing, there's a field. I will meet you there. Do you want to go to that field? Do we want to be in that field together, you and I and everyone? Do we want to be there? And if so, how do we do this? How do we move beyond the delusions? So perhaps, a little bit from Buddhism about how these things form. And this is a huge topic. You can research it on the internet. It's development of the ego is the general topic. And the analogy that they use is a monkey inside a locked house. And if you just search for that, development of the ego, monkey inside a locked house, you will find resources that may lead you to the library, and you can dig a little bit deeper. But the idea is that there was this monkey who was in the forest, living happily as monkeys do in the forest, swinging in the trees, picking the food from the trees, eating, happy, playing, doing all the things that monkeys do, and he blacked out. And when he awoke, he was in a house, and the house was locked. And the only thing that he could see was there were 5 windows. These represent the 5 senses. These were 5 windows that he could go and he could look out. And the monkey would go and he would look out the windows, and he would run from one window to the other window to the other window to the other window. And he would look out them, right? And he's inside this locked house, and he's looking out at the world out there. And he starts to develop these ideas. He starts to perhaps get angry and push against the walls. He starts to get bored. He starts to explore the house and find parts of the house that he likes. Distracts himself from the fact that he's prisoner inside this house by finding things to do, things to entertain himself. Eventually he gets so accustomed to being in that house and only seeing the world through the 5 windows that becomes his reality. Then he can start to live his life inside the confines of those walls. And of course the metaphor there is that this is our consciousness. This is our awareness as human beings. We come into awareness inside these bodies or through these bodies or as these bodies. And everything that we know about the world that we live in comes in through our senses. You know, we see it, we hear it, we touch it, we smell it, we taste it. And in interpreting this sensory input, the first thing you got to do is say, well, where is that interpretation done? What part of the being is it that interprets it? But in interpreting the sensory input, we kind of accept it as being all that there is. You know, some schools of science tell us the only things that we know are what we receive through the senses. The only things we can know are the things that we can weigh and measure and touch. And we forget that there is something, some part of us that is processing all of this. What is that part of us that is processing all of this? What is that part of us that is forming these opinions? So we get so enamored with the opinions about the way the world is, and these people are good people, and those people are bad people, and this is right, and that's wrong. We get so enamored with these opinions that we start to live our lives as if they were true. And in growth, we have to say, well, maybe they're just opinions. Maybe they're just ideas. Maybe we need to escape the delusions of the mind. And where are we going to go if we escape? And the best description, I think, is the one that Rumi gives us, to that field beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing, to that place of awareness without judgment, to that place of awareness that is not caught up in or fooled by the appearances of the mind. So I'm going to list, and you can, if you don't get them the first time I go through them, I'll be going through them again, but you can get the video off of YouTube, and you might write them down. These come from Emma Curtis Hopkins in her book Scientific Christian Mental Practice, which is an excellent book, hard to read, but an excellent book. And the first thing we have to consider is this idea of unity and of harmony. There is only one. There is only one. And our fundamental belief in the human mind, in the ideas that we formulated. Now remember, we had to be left alone to formulate these ideas so we could discover our uniqueness. It's all part of an unfoldment. It's part of something that we eventually will move through. However long it takes, we will eventually move through it. Excuse me. But in this experience that we were having, we have come to believe in separation. We have come to believe that we are different and separated from each other, that life is somehow separated from the power that created it, that there is a power for good and a power for evil as personified in beliefs of the devil. We believe in more than one, more than one. So the first delusion that we have to at least be aware of, at least be aware that it's there, is this belief in two powers, this belief in separation, this belief that we have been cast out of the garden. Okay? And this idea that we have been cast out of the garden is an idea. It is an idea. It is the knowledge of good and evil, right? It doesn't say that good and evil are real things. It says they're the knowledge of good and evil, the delusion of good and evil, the belief that there are two powers. And that's a hard one for us, but it's a good one. It's a good one for us to look at because we can see it in our everyday lives. When we go through and we start to think, well, God is good, but people, not so much. Or as Emerson said, I love humanity, it's just the people that drive me crazy. We think that the divine God, whatever name we choose to call it, it has all it needs, but somehow we don't. Somehow we are separated from that. The divine knows everything, but somehow we don't know. See, this idea of separation permeates our existence, and we live our lives according to that belief that somehow we are separate from that which has created us. That the very love that animates our being, right? The intelligence that beats our hearts and moves our lungs, the wisdom and the power that created our magnificent bodies out of a sperm and an egg, that somehow it abandoned us after we were born. So the first delusion that we want to consider is this one of separation. We want to consider the I am. We want to consider the words of the New Testament. I and the Father are one, and you and I are one. And we want to catch ourselves, become aware. If you want to change a habit, you have to become aware of when you are habitually engaging in whatever habit it is that you're trying to break. Back in the 80s, excuse me, they had a smoking cessation clinic that came through the office, and one of the things they did was they gave everybody a little piece of paper and a little pencil like you use for keeping score in golf, and that piece of paper just fit down the side of the pack of cigarettes underneath the cellophane, and the idea was it had times on it. And the idea was that when somebody went for a cigarette, they would put a mark at whatever time it was to look for patterns. And what they were doing was forcing people to become aware of when they were going for a cigarette. If you want to change a habit, if you're for example playing golf and your game is off, you have to go to a coach, and the coach can force you to become aware. Did you notice that you're on your backswing? Did you notice that you're doing this? You've got a hitch in your backswing. Let's try this differently. So the first thing with a habit is we have to become aware. So if we think of the belief in separation, the belief in duality, Dr. Holmes tells us that's the fundamental belief, and from that all other beliefs come. All other delusions come, if you want to think of it that way. When during the day do we conduct ourselves as if duality, as if separation were real? We can become aware of that. We can observe ourselves. That's the one thing that we as human beings can do that so far we don't know of any other creature on earth that can do it. We can become aware of what we're thinking. We can become aware of ourselves. So the first delusion is this one of separation. And the opposite of that is unity and harmony. And this is why when we start praying, you hear me start saying there's only one life, and that life is God. And that life is perfect. And that life is my life right now. But it has to be more than words. It has to come the realization that this is true. So the second thing that we want to think of, the second delusion that our society has bought into, is that matter itself has power. And what Emma Curtis Hopkins tells us is to flat out say there's no such thing as matter. There's only spirit. And we would look at that and say, well, my goodness, that's ridiculous. We've got tables, we've got chairs, we've got automobiles, and if automobiles bang into one another, they crunch. Surely there's matter. But what is matter, but energy taking form. And what is the energy? But spirit. So if we close our eyes, I love the pictures of the Hubble sends back. We close our eyes and we think about this vast universe, and somehow we have the invisible energy of the universe coming into form, forming galaxies, forming universes, forming stars, forming planets. It comes in and it takes form. And it looks solid to us, you know, until we get a microscope and we can look down a little bit further. And we find out that that which appeared to be solid is not solid at all. There's a bunch of protons and neutrons and electrons at the Newtonian level, and then subatomic particles, the quantum particles. And it really gets crazy when you start to get into reading about quantum mechanics, and they say, well, the electron is not really always there. It's just probably there. But when you look for it, it is there. So now tell me, what is matter? What is matter? And the importance of this is that we have come to believe that matter itself has a power. In other words, is matter something that is taking a form? Or is matter something that actually has a power to create form? Does consciousness create matter? Or does matter create consciousness? When it comes to thinking of health, do cells have the ability to create disease, for example? So we want to start to think about, when do we, in our daily language, when do we, as we go through the day, when do we buy into the delusion of matter? That matter is more powerful than spirit, for example. And we do it all the time. We do it all the time. Oh, well, it was in the genes, you know, it was something in the genes that caused that illness and those kind of things. And that may be true, that that's the way it appears to be working. But there's something more powerful. There's something that brought that matter into existence. That it is spirit appearing as matter. And if we can come to recognize the world and our bodies, if we can come to recognize that this is a spiritual system, you know, this is the idea in Genesis that God took the clay, took 100 pounds of clay, and breathed life into the nostrils. Adam means clay man, man of the earth. We are more than just these chemical elements. There is something more. See? The next thing that we want to consider is this delusion of absence. We call it absence. We say that the divine is omniscient. It is perfect intelligence. It is all-knowing. Whatever there is to know, it knows. And we say that it is everywhere presence. It's omnipresence, all presence. All presence is part of this whole, part of this unity, part of this oneness. And then we start to think, but not over there. See, not over there, not over here. We think that somehow there's an absence. We think that there's a duality, there's a mixture of evil in with good. And then we think that good can withhold itself from here or there, particularly in the people we don't like. You know, God is perfect intelligence, but not in those people over there, because they're all a bunch of not too bright folks, you know, or political enemies, for example. So we believe that. We believe that somehow the goodness, somehow the goodness of the divine can be absent. Somehow perfect health can be absent. Somehow perfect supply and abundance can be absent. Somehow wisdom and intelligence and knowing what to do can be absent. I hear this so much when people say, well, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. I don't know. There is that within us which does know. And if we could just simply change that affirmation that we're making from saying I don't know to saying there's that within me which does know, and it is now revealing what needs to be done here, our day would be entirely different. The fourth thing that Emma Curtis Hopkins tells us to consider is there's nothing to hate. Excuse me, and this brings us to struggle, to hate or to struggle. In the way of the world, what we tend to do, the ego loves to fight. It loves to struggle. So typically, the ego would say, well, there are delusions of the mind. I need to get in there and I need to beat them up. I need to blow them up. I need to get rid of them. I need to find them. I need to dig them out. And the more that we are trying to struggle against something, the more we are affirming the reality of it. It's like, you know, it's like shadow boxing. It's like the children in the playground who are frightened by their shadow. The shadow's nothing, but they believe that it is something. And they look at their shadow and they get scared and they wave their hands and the shadow waves its hands back at them and they get even more frightened. See? So they are stuck. They are stuck into the struggle with that which is in itself not real. In itself not real. So there's nothing to hate. This is a very difficult one, I think, for us as human beings. There's nothing to hate. And Joel Goldsmith cautions us. He says, don't ever personalize evil. Don't ever personalize evil. What we want to try to keep in mind is that the entire human race is struggling from the same delusions. And we don't want to struggle with that which is not real. We don't need to waste our time and energy hating that which is not real. We want to turn away from the false appearances. We want to recognize that all that we are seeing out there is the outpicturing of a delusion of mind. And we can move away from that beyond ideas of right doing, beyond ideas of wrongdoing. To where they dissolve into the nothingness from which they came. And the last one that she gives us, and this is another one that is a big one. She gives us in her 5 denials. The last one that she gives us is there is no sin, there is no sickness, there is no death. Very big one. We believe in that. We believe in the necessity of these things. We believe in the reality of these things. And we have to bring ourselves back to that unconditioned mind, that undifferentiated mind, to that field beyond ideas of right doing and wrongdoing. Life is. Life is neither good nor bad. Life is. And when we can get to that point, then there is no sin. We could say that, as the Buddhists might tell us, the only sin is unconsciousness. The only sin is that we stay stuck in our delusions and we don't make any attempt to escape from them. But there's no scorekeeper. There's no one trying to keep a book like Santa Claus of the things that we do that are good and the things that we do that aren't good, and hold that against us. And again, this comes back to the idea that we have this idea of separation, we have this idea of absence, we have this idea of two powers, and then we have this idea of punishment, guilt and punishment. These are parts of the delusion. These are parts of this ignorance has been heaped upon us. That's the way I heard a philosopher put it one time. Sickness has no power of its own. If God is the only power, go back to step one, if God is the only power, then where does the power of sickness come from? We believe in it. We accept it. We think it's necessary. But that's part of the delusion. And the big one comes to death. See, again, this is kind of going back to there's no such thing as matter. There's only spirit. If matter creates consciousness, then when the body dies, consciousness dies and we die. But we are not the body. We are the awareness within the body that is looking out through the windows of the five senses, that is trying to interpret everything. We were never born, we will never die. We may have blacked out and come to awaken inside this locked house of the body, and we're trying to make sense of everything. But we were never born, we shall never die, because we are part of life itself. So I think we'll pick it up from here next week, and we'll start to talk about some specific practices that we can engage in on a daily basis to help break ourselves out of these delusions. And if you get a chance during the week, you might want to go and search on the internet for the development of ego and the metaphor of the monkey inside the locked house. Let yourself be exposed to some more ideas along these lines. But for today, let's just close by recognizing that that which is perfect, which we call God, cannot create that which is imperfect. It cannot. That which is perfect, that which we call God, cannot know imperfection, because what God knows becomes. It cannot know sin or sickness or death, or it would get sick and die. It cannot be locked into an eternal power struggle with another power its opposite and equal, or they would annihilate each other. There is only one life, and that life is God, and that life is perfect. And that life has created each and every one of us out of itself and left us alone to make that discovery. And as we were alone, as the human race was alone in making that discovery, it formed all of these opinions as it was looking out the windows of the senses and trying to figure out how all this came to be. It formed erroneous ideas. It formed delusions. It accepted those delusions as the truth. It developed religions and cultures and societies around them and laws. And our spiritual growth then, yours and mine, is to escape those delusions. Excuse me. So next week we're going to pick up with part 2, the practice of escaping our delusions. And so it is.